The Little Ice Age descends. The warmth began to wane sometime in the late 13th century. It was subtle at first, like a breath caught in the chest of the earth. A shift in the rhythm of seasons. Spring arrived slower, summer grew shorter, and autumn carried a sharper chill. People still planted their crops, as they had for generations, but the harvests were a little lighter, the fruits a little fewer, the grain a little harder to mill. No one yet spoke of crisis, only of strange weather. By the 14th century, the change had settled into the land. Europe entered a time that would later be named, much later, the Little Ice Age, a long, uncertain coldness that would stretch for centuries, whispering frost into the bones of medieval life. No one could explain it. There were no satellites then, no carbon graphs, no climate models, only eyes watching skies that darkened too soon and ears listening to the silence of failed crops. Some said it was punishment, others a sign of divine imbalance. But the truth, as we now know, was a convergence of things. Volcanic ash dimming the sun, ocean currents swaying off their ancient paths, solar cycles dancing to a colder tune. Still, none of this mattered to the people beneath the sky. They only knew the winters were longer now, and they were changing everything. The peasants were the first to feel it. Their lives were tuned to nature's breath. When to till, when to sow, when to reap, when to rest. But the land began to betray them. Rains lingered for months, drowning young seedlings. Frosts arrived early and lingered late, blackening leaves before fruit could ripen. What food they managed to bring in had to be hoarded, bartered, dried in cellars and lofts. There was no surplus. There was only enough, sometimes not even that. A single bad harvest might be survived, but bad harvests came in twos, in threes. Hunger became the season that stretched beyond the calendar, and winter, already dreaded, grew monstrous. In towns and cities, the changes were quieter, but no less severe. Rivers that once flowed steady now froze solid. Trade slowed, ships became trapped in icy harbors. Markets shrank, wages fell. Even the guilds grew lean, as craftspeople struggled to afford fuel or food. The poor multiplied. Beggars with frostbitten fingers sat outside cathedrals, wrapped in threadbare shawls. Children's cheeks turned hollow by December. Animals starved beside their masters. The weather grew stranger. In 1315, unrelenting rain fell for months across northern Europe. It was the beginning of what would become the Great Famine. Fields turned to rot. Grain molded in its sacks. Horses and oxen collapsed under the strain. In France and England alike, families scraped bark from trees. Some boiled the leather from shoes. There are stories, grim, soft-spoken stories, of children abandoned or worse, of quiet, unspeakable choices made in dark rooms with empty cupboards. Yet winter remained indifferent. Not even the wealthy escaped untouched. Castles built of stone became cold tombs in January. Fireplaces sputtered against icy drafts that curled through every corridor. Servants sealed windows with rags, brought hot stones to warm beds, and labored endlessly to keep hearths blazing. Still, noble women shivered beneath furs. Lords complained of aching joints and restless nights. The cold reached even into royal chambers. Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, they say, was found one morning frozen beneath layers of fur. Her palace no match for the deep bite of that January. There were those who adapted. In some monasteries, monks carefully recorded snowfall levels and ice patterns. In towns, bakers adjusted their yeast for colder kitchens. Farmers experimented with hardier crops, rye instead of wheat, barley over oats. In southern Europe, where winters remained gentler, olive trees and vineyards grew in importance. But north of the Alps, the people dug deeper into old patterns of endurance. Communities drew closer. Villages became more than geography. They became survival systems, a neighbor with firewood, a friend with extra broth, a church that still had bread to bless. The cold that had scattered birds and silenced streams also pressed people together. Shared hardship became shared identity. Winters were endured together, or not at all. Still, the cold carried on. It wasn't a single winter, or even a decade. It was generations of chill. Children who had never known another kind of spring. Elders who could no longer recall the last gentle summer. The little ice age did not shout. It whispered. It pressed slowly. It remade the world in silence and frost. Even the flow of history bent beneath it. Wars paused for snow. Crops changed. Fortunes rose and fell depending not on skill or birthright, but on the strength of a community's woodpile and the depth of its cellar. The age of nights gave way to the age of bread, and bread, more often than not, was broken too thinly, too carefully. And yet, humanity endured, not through conquest, not through brilliance, but through patience, through the steady repetition of survival, through fires lit each night, through songs sung while fingers stitched worn cloaks, through prayers whispered into the smoke. The earth was colder now, but people still hoped. They watched the sky still for signs, for the faintest sense of spring. And as the snow deepened outside their windows, they listened for something in the wind, something soft, something sacred, something that might tell them whether the cold had truly come to stay. A winter of empty stomachs. The snow came softly, but it never came alone. Behind its silence followed wind, hunger, and the long unraveling of comfort. In medieval Europe, the peasant's life was already thin. Winter made it thinner. Most peasants lived in cottages built not for warmth, but for necessity. One room, low ceilings, a thatched roof darkened with smoke. The walls, made of wattle and daub, barely held back the wind. A fire burned constantly in the center, but there was no chimney, only a hole in the roof where the smoke escaped like a spirit searching for peace. The air inside was heavy, warm only by comparison to the frost outside. And still, it was home. They shared this space with animals, chickens underfoot, a goat tied near the door, sometimes even the family pig. Their breath added to the heat, their bodies an extension of the family's survival. In the harshest months, a cow might be brought indoors, not for love, but for warmth and milk. These were not homes in the way we know them. They were shelters, bare, practical, lived in with quiet reverence. Clothing was layered, if you had layers. Wool tunics, patched breeches, coarse cloaks, boots made of leather, if one was lucky, or simple wrappings of cloth and twine. Mittens were rare, and frostbite was common. Fingers turned pale, cracked open, and bled. Noses blackened in the night. There were no salves, only scarves, if you had one, and the hope that the wind would ease by morning. Each day was a balancing act. Firewood had to be gathered, though the forest floor was slick with ice. If the household had a boy old enough, he went out early, stomping paths through the snow. Girls stayed behind, kneading what flour was left, feeding scraps to the hens, keeping the fire alive with dried brush. The old stirred porridge with tired hands, measuring each spoonful as if it were gold. Meals were often the same, a watery stew of root vegetables and beans, perhaps with a sliver of meat left over from autumn slaughter. Sometimes only bread, coarse, dark, and hardening too fast. Food was not eaten for pleasure. It was rationed like medicine. And when food ran low, the forest became a silent provider. Nettles, wild onions, mushrooms, whatever had not yet vanished beneath the snow. Peasants knew the land not through books, but through hunger. They knew which weeds were bitter, but safe, which bark could be boiled, which plants brought sickness. The margin for error was thin. Hunger itself was a companion, not a visitor, not an intruder, but something that lived among them, quiet, persistent, familiar. Children cried less after the third day. They learned to wait, to chew slowly, to give the last bite to the smallest sibling. Mothers often went without. Fathers worked with hollow bellies. Everyone hoped for a kind spring, but hope was not something you could eat. Still, life went on. There were chores to do, livestock to tend. Even in the frost, the rhythm continued. Hooves had to be cleaned. The well had to be broken open and drawn from. If a sheep died, its wool was pulled, its bones boiled, its skin cured. Nothing could be wasted. Waste was a luxury for those who didn't fear February. Illness came as it always did, carried on breath and touch. Fevers rose in the night. Coughs echoed through thin walls. There were herbs, dry bundles of yarrow, sage, feverfew, tucked away from summer's harvest. But often it was too late. Babies shivered and stopped crying. Grandfathers exhaled one last time beneath heavy quilts. Death in winter didn't knock. It simply settled in. And yet, there was laughter. Quiet, tired, real. Jokes shared near the fire when the wind screamed loud outside and the stew managed to boil. A song hummed by an old woman spinning flax. A story told by the firelight about a fox outsmarting a king. Small comforts, small escapes, woven into the hours like wool into thread. Holidays arrived even in hunger. St. Stephen's Day brought small cheer. A shared loaf, a shared drink, a moment where peasants played nobles and forgot, just briefly, the ache in their bones. Candles flickered in church windows. Bells rang over snow-covered hills. They prayed for warmth, for food, for the return of green. These winters weren't singular. They came year after year. Children grew into adults who had never known ease. They built their resilience in layers, just like their clothing, thin, patched, but enduring. There was no concept of fairness, only weather and work and the will to rise again when the rooster crowed. When spring finally stirred, it was not with trumpets or fanfare. It was with melting snow dripping from the eaves, a sprig of green at the edge of the field, a lamb born healthy, and suddenly hunger eased, not gone, but softened. Life became less a struggle and more a rhythm once again. But until then, the fire needed more wood, the stew needed to stretch another day, and the wind, still cold, still constant, whispered at the door like a memory that refused to fade. Cold behind stone walls, the castles stood tall above the valleys, their towers wrapped in fog, their walls thick with age. From a distance, they seemed untouchable, gray monoliths rising above the frost-covered fields, homes to lords and ladies, to silk and feast, to comfort. But stone is not warmth, and within those walls, winter lingered just the same. Nobles dressed in velvet and fur. They dined on silver platters. Their cellars were full, their larders stocked, yet even they could not command the weather. The wind crept through the cracks in the towers, down long hallways lined with rushes, into great halls where the fire barely reached the corners. The hearth blazed, yes, but it was one hearth in a room built for ceremony, not heat. Servants moved in silence, feeding the flames with logs hauled up spiral staircases. They carried braziers to warm the chambers, hot stones wrapped in cloth to slip between the sheets. Curtains were drawn tightly around beds, not for modesty, but to trap the fragile warmth of sleeping bodies. Still, the frost etched itself on windows. Still, breath misted in the morning air. Ladies of the court wrapped themselves in layers, wool beneath silk, fur-lined mantles over chemises. Their hands, gloved and pale, stayed close to their sleeves. Jewels lost their sparkle in the dim winter light. They sat beside fires, with embroidery hoops, their stitches slower, their fingers stiffer. Music still played, softly from the corner of the room, but the lutes needed constant tuning. The cold warped the strings. In the kitchens, warmth was more certain. Fires burned around the clock. Pots simmered, bread baked, meat roasted on spits. The scullions and cooks sweated through winter, feeding not just the appetite, but the illusion of abundance. Servants snuck sips of broth. Sometimes they slept on the hearthstones. But the warmth here was temporary, a bubble. Once they left for the upper halls, the cold wrapped around them again like a second skin. Even royalty could not escape the reach of winter. Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, they say, died in the night from the cold. She had fur, servants, a palace. But stone holds cold longer than air, and once it seeps into the marrow, not even crown nor prayer can drive it out. She passed beneath layers of velvet, in silence, her hands clasped in sleep that never lifted. And so castles, for all their power, became quiet places in winter. The corridors grew hushed. Grand events were postponed or shortened. Feasts were fewer, music less joyful. Instead, there were letters read by firelight, long walks abandoned, and the soft scratching of quills in cold libraries. In the countryside, nobles still visited their tenants. Mounted hunts continued, though the forest offered fewer rewards. A stag, if found, was considered divine providence, but often the dogs returned empty-mouthed, their paws bleeding from ice. Horses struggled on frozen paths. Riders wrapped themselves in layers and still returned with blue lips. Inside, the chapel remained warmest. Tucked in stone, close to the heart of the castle, it kept the cold at bay better than most. Candles burned day and night. Psalms filled the space between stone and soul. There, nobles prayed for the spring, for peace, for an easier winter next year. They prayed in silence, heads bowed beneath fur-trimmed hoods, each breath curling like incense toward the vaulted ceiling. Children played less in these months. The cold bit their cheeks, chapped their hands. Tutors wrapped them in blankets as they recited Latin, and nurses rubbed oil on their cracking skin. Toys carved from wood lay untouched in corners. There was no running in the courtyard, no splashing in the fountain. Just quiet and waiting. The nobles were better off, certainly. They had food. They had shelter. But comfort in the Middle Ages was relative. Warmth came in pockets, in moments, not as a constant. Even kings shivered. Even queens wept when illness came for their children, the same illness that swept through villages and farms. The line between rich and poor narrowed in winter. The same frost settled on every rooftop. The same sickness passed through every door. And though the lords had more layers, more candles, more meat on the table, they too looked toward the horizon with longing. They too counted the days until the thaw. Even power has limits. And the cold did not kneel. It passed through locked doors, into royal beds, into the bones of dukes and the dreams of princesses. It reminded them that they were flesh, that they were breath, that they too depended on the fire being lit in time. Outside, the world waited. Snow piled in the courtyard. Icicles hung like daggers from the turrets. A hawk circled in the pale sky, its shadow brushing against stone. And somewhere, in the deep heart of the castle, a candle flickered, as if unsure whether to hold on or fade into darkness. Sickness in the shadows. When the cold came, it did not come alone. It brought with it a quiet companion, illness. In the still, breathless corners of medieval Europe, where fires smoked and bodies pressed close, sickness waited patiently in the dark. Homes were small, one room, maybe two. Inside, entire families slept side by side, wrapped in wool and rough linens, their breath rising together into the rafters. The walls held in the heat, but also the damp. Smoke from the hearth lingered in the air, making eyes water and lungs ache. The windows, if there were any, stayed shuttered against the wind. Air did not move. Germs did. There was no understanding of contagion, not in the way we know it. People believed illness was carried by bad air, by spirits, by imbalance in the humors. And so, they lit herbs to ward off evil, hung garlic in doorways, whispered prayers into the flames. But illness paid no mind to ritual. It found the weakest, the coldest, the most exhausted, and took root. Coughs started in the night. First one, then another. A baby fussed in its mother's arms. A grandfather wheezed into the straw mattress. Children woke with flushed cheeks and chills. There were no thermometers, no antibiotics, only fever and waiting. Pneumonia came often in the winter. So did influenza, though they didn't call it that. They called it the winter fever or the wasting cough. It moved from family to family, house to house, street to street. One neighbor fell ill, then the household next door, then the baker's wife, then the priest. Even the noble halls were not immune. Servants lived in close quarters. Pages slept on straw near the kitchens. Visitors from other manors brought more than letters. A single cough could echo down the stone corridors like a prophecy. Nobles hired physicians, of course, learned men with long robes and serious eyes. They offered tinctures, leeches, advice. They burned incense in the sick room. They recited prayers in Latin. But sickness listened to no language. When one fell ill in a village, the others gathered near, not to flee, but to help. They brought broth. They kept the fire going. They changed the cloths on the brow. Death was not something whispered about behind doors. It was lived beside, mourned beside, endured together. Children were most at risk. Their small bodies could not hold warmth for long. A single night of shivering could take them. Mothers wrapped them in every scrap of cloth, held them close, sang lullabies even when there was no voice left to sing. In some regions, small trinkets were tied around infants' wrists, charms against fever, against spirits, against despair. The elderly, too, faded in winter. Their joints stiffened, their breath grew shallow. A cold caught in the lungs became something deeper, something final. Often, they said nothing, only smiled gently and closed their eyes as the snow fell outside. And still, life went on. The sick rooms were part of the rhythm, a place in the home, not apart from it. Children played near their grandparents' beds. Women spun wool while watching over a fevered cousin. Sickness was not dramatic. It was ordinary, expected. An old companion returned for another season. Monasteries tried to help. Monks brewed healing teas from dried herbs, mint, yarrow, sage. They rubbed oils into the chest, murmured verses, wrapped the ill in warm linen. In some places, leper houses stood just outside the village, their doors always open, their windows filled with candlelight. But remedies were few, and often the body healed only if it chose to. Some recovered slowly, coughing for weeks. Others simply slipped away. Despite the danger, people stayed close. There was no quarantine, no space to separate. Proximity was warmth, and so they touched and tended and hoped. Funerals were quiet. A cloth over the face, a procession through the snow, the grave dug shallow in the frozen earth. Sometimes a flower from a summer past was laid on the chest, dried, faded, but still soft, a memory of warmth in a world turned white. And then the living returned home, to the fire, the stew, the silence. There was no blaming, no outrage, only the soft understanding that winter did this, that it always had, that it would again. And so, when the first cough echoed through a house in January, no one panicked. They gathered closer, lit another candle, heated broth on the fire, and waited. Outside, the wind howled, snow fell gently on rooftops, and in the stillness, another night passed, soft and heavy and full of breath. The hollow winter table. There were winters when the table sat empty. Not entirely, there was always something, but sometimes what filled the bowls was barely enough to be called food. A thin gruel, a chunk of stale bread, a root boiled until it softened. In medieval Europe, hunger came not as a surprise, but as a season. It arrived with the frost and stayed long after the last snow melted. Famine was not a rare disaster. It was a returning guest. The year 1315 marked the beginning of one of the worst. That spring, the rains did not stop. For weeks, then months, the sky remained gray, and the fields turned to soup. Seeds drowned in the soil. Oxen collapsed in the mud. The harvest failed. Then it failed again. 3 years of wet, hungry darkness. The great famine stretched from village to city to royal court. No one was untouched. In the countryside, the people watched their grain stores shrink. What had been set aside for winter dwindled far too early. Salted meats spoiled in the damp. Barrels of ale turned sour. Even the rats, who usually scurried behind sacks of barley, disappeared. There was nothing left to steal, so they rationed. Parents skipped meals so children could eat. Women mixed sawdust into bread. They boiled moss and made soups from bark. It was not enough. Bodies grew thinner, faces hollowed, bellies bloated with starvation. Still, they gathered around the table each night, because the act of eating, even when the food was meager, was a ritual of hope, a silent declaration. We are still here. We are still trying. In towns, food prices soared. Bakers couldn't find grain. Butchers had nothing to offer. Markets shrank, then vanished. There are records of people paying a silver coin for a crust of bread, and of desperate men stealing turnips from monastery gardens. Punishments were harsh. Hunger made people bold. Nobles, too, felt this pinch. They had stores, but their dependents were many. Entire estates had to be fed, servants, soldiers, livestock. What once fed hundreds fed half that. Guests were sent away. Feasts became stews. Even kings shortened banquets. And when the famine lasted too long, something darker stirred beneath the surface. In hidden corners, there were whispers of mothers burying children not from sickness, but starvation. Of villagers turning to animals not meant for food, cats, dogs, birds, and worse, of bodies disappearing, not into graves, but into kitchens. The records are spare, the details avoided, but famine does not care for dignity. Still, there were glimmers of kindness. Neighbors shared what they could: a handful of dried peas, a piece of bread, split in two. Monasteries opened their doors to the starving. Priests gave communion from trembling hands. In the harshest winters, these quiet acts of mercy were the only warmth to be found. And through it all, life continued. Babies were born, marriages were held, prayers were whispered over cold loaves of barley bread. Hunger shaped the rhythm of days. How far people walked, how long they worked, how much they spoke. It carved itself into the faces of entire generations. In some villages, they painted marks on the door when a house ran out of food. It was a silent signal, a cry for help. Sometimes help came, sometimes it didn't. Spring always promised relief, but in famine years, the land could not deliver. Even when the sun returned, the soil needed rest. It had been drowned, starved, turned bitter. The first sprouts were watched like omens. Every seed counted, every leaf a prayer. Eventually, the rains did stop. The famine of 1315 ended, not in celebration, but in exhaustion. The survivors carried on, thinner, quieter, more cautious. They rebuilt cellars, they planted again, but they never forgot the taste of an empty bowl. And famine did not forget them. It returned again in 1321, and again in later decades, some milder, some worse. It became part of the cycle. Not a disaster, but a pattern. The people did not ask why. They simply endured. Because in winter, food was not guaranteed. In winter, the earth offered little. In winter, even the strong grew weak. And the table, once the center of life, became a reminder of how fragile that life truly was. Still, each evening, they lit a candle, placed what they had on the wooden board, passed the bowl in silence, and gave thanks, not for the abundance, but for the company. Because sometimes, the only thing heavier than an empty stomach was an empty chair. A day of warmth in the bleakest season. The cold did not pause for celebration. It continued its slow drift through stone and skin, filling corners and hearts alike with silence. But deep in the heart of winter, when the nights were longest and the hunger sharpest, something gentle stirred, a flicker of joy, a day of brightness carved from darkness. The feast of St. Stephen. It fell on the 26th of December, just after the sacred hush of Christmas, but still buried within the chill of midwinter. And unlike the solemnity of Holy Mass, St. Stephen's Day was different. It was playful, messy, full of the earthy laughter that survived even in famine years. For one day, the rules loosened. The hearth grew louder, and people remembered what it felt like to smile. In villages, the morning began slowly. The fires were coaxed awake. Bits of dried fruit or crumb cheese might be added to the pot if there was any to spare. Children rose earlier, their breath puffing clouds as they waited for the first light. Even the old ones, who groaned when moving from their beds, found reason to rise with less complaint. The day belonged to giving. St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was remembered for his charity, his service to the poor. And so, the peasants gave what they could. Leftover apples, a heel of bread, a spindle of wool, sometimes just a song or a story. It was not the gift, but the giving that mattered. But more than charity, there was mischief. In many places, a tradition took root: the Lord of Misrule. A young man, sometimes a peasant, sometimes a stable boy, was crowned in jest. He wore a garland for a crown, carried a ladle as a scepter, and ruled the feast with laughter. He commanded the nobles to dance. He interrupted prayers with riddles. He presided over mock trials, where the accused were found guilty of stealing pies or hiding the last onion. It was nonsense, of course, but it was sacred nonsense, a ritual of reversal. For one day, the great became small, and the small became great. Hierarchies melted like snow on warm stone. The laughter that followed was more than fun. It was relief, a kind of communal breath, exhaled after too many days of silence. In manors and castles, the celebration was more formal, but the spirit remained. The servants were honored with extra food. Ale was poured freely. Games were played in the courtyard, if the frost allowed. Music echoed through high halls. Even the nobles, stiff with duty, softened. A lady of the house might wear a ribbon in her hair instead of a veil. A lord might sing a tune from his boyhood, off-key and smiling. The poor watched and joined when they could. Some were invited in. Others made their own joy, outside the manor gates, dancing around a bonfire built from scraps of last year's furniture. The fire cracked and hissed like an old man's story. Sparks flew upward like prayers. Children clapped with mittened hands. And for a few hours, the weight of the season lifted. The food was never enough, but it was shared. A crust from the miller, a stew from the blacksmith's wife, a pot of cider, heated until it steamed. People gathered close, not just for warmth, but for company. They sang songs older than memory, told tales of saints and spirits, of foxes who stole fire and lovers turned into stars. The cold sat on the edge of the circle, watching, unwelcome for a while. For those who had lost someone that year, it was a bittersweet day. An empty stool by the fire, a cup not poured, but even grief was honored, quietly, in the toasts and the stories. No one was forgotten, not in winter. As the evening wore on, the misrule faded, the garland was returned, the laughter softened, and one by one, people slipped away into the dark, back to their huts, back to their cellars, back to the stillness of the season. But something lingered, a glow perhaps, or just the memory of it, the knowledge that even in hardship, there was space for celebration, that even in hunger, joy could still be summoned, and that even the coldest of nights could hold music and dancing and warmth, if only for a little while. The Feast of St. Stephen did not solve hunger. It did not end winter, but it reminded people that they were more than mouths to feed, more than bodies to keep warm. They were souls, and souls, when gathered, could burn brighter than any fire. And though the morning would bring another gray sky, another thin meal, another walk through snow and wind, for this one night, the darkness had been held at bay. Not by wealth, not by power, but by the simple miracle of people remembering how to be glad. When the plow returned to the earth, the ground had long been sleeping. Months of frost had hardened it like stone. Nothing green dared rise through the frozen crust. It seemed impossible that life would return, that anything soft or living could survive the silence of such a winter. And yet, there came a day, always in January, just after the holy days had ended, when the people began to believe again. They called it Plow Monday. It fell on the first Monday after Epiphany, a quiet holiday for most of the Christian world. But for the medieval peasant, it marked something greater than liturgy. It was the true beginning of the year, the return to labor, the first ceremonial touch of hand to soil. It began at dawn. The sun still slept behind a gray veil, but already men were stirring, wrapping their cloaks tighter, their breath clouding the chill. Outside, the plow was waiting, not yet in use, just resting, cleaned and ready, decorated with bits of ribbon or dried flowers saved from the harvest. Sometimes, a small statue of the Virgin was tucked near the yoke. Other times, a candle was lit beside it. These were not superstitions. They were prayers, spoken through gestures. The oxen stood in the cold, steam rising from their flanks. They had waited all winter too, fed, cared for, but idle. Now they were called back into the rhythm. They would pull, and the earth would open. But before the fields, there was the procession. Villagers walked together, the men pulling the plow through the lanes of their parish, not yet to till the land, but to remind it they were coming. Children ran alongside. The women followed singing, some with bells stitched into their sleeves. They moved slowly, reverently, as if the land itself needed to be woken not with tools, but with kindness. They knocked on doors along the way, collecting coins or bread for the poor. This, too, was part of the rite, to give before you took. At the head of the parade, someone carried the cross. Behind him, the plow creaked. There were no grand speeches, no fiery sermons, only the steady rhythm of boots in snow, the creak of wooden wheels, the murmur of breath and song. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was something older than that, a solemn kind of hope, the kind that survives. By midday, they returned to the fields. The ground was still hard. The oxen struggled. The men leaned into the plow. But eventually, the soil broke. A thin, dark line appeared, cutting across the white crust. It was a wound, but a sacred one. The first furrow of the year. People knelt beside it. Some crossed themselves. Others placed a hand on the raw earth, feeling its coldness, its patience, its readiness. Plow Monday wasn't just about farming. It was about renewal, about trusting the seasons, trusting that the earth, for all its silence, would respond. That after all the death and stillness and hunger, life would return. The evening was quieter. People returned to their homes with tired arms and wind-burned cheeks. But the fire felt warmer now. The stew tasted fuller. There was something different in the air, an edge of movement, a sense that the great wheel of the year had begun to turn once more. In some homes, they blessed a loaf of bread and buried a small piece at the corner of the field, an offering to the old spirits, or perhaps to God, or perhaps to both. In others, they carved simple runes into the wooden handles of their tools. Protection, prosperity, continuance. Children were told stories of seeds that slept through the cold, only to rise with the spring sun, of birds that returned with the thaw, of saints who blessed farmers and animals alike. The stories weren't new, but they sounded different after Plow Monday. They sounded possible. And as the night deepened and the stars blinked over empty fields, the plow rested once more. This time, beside fresh earth, beside the promise of food, beside the memory of human hands turning stone into soil. Winter was far from over. Snow would fall again. Illness would pass through the villages once more. But something had changed. The plow had broken the silence. The people had touched the land again. And somewhere deep beneath the frost, the seeds were listening. The snow determined the pace. There was no need for clocks in the depths of medieval winter. No one watched the sun for time. No one measured the hours in minutes. They measured it in frost on the shutters, in how long the bread took to rise, in how soon the wind returned to the chimney. It was the snow that ruled them now, soft, silent, absolute. When it fell, everything changed. The fields, once busy with labor, fell still. The plow paused. The wheelbarrow stopped creaking. The animals tucked into barns and stables, and the people, too, slowed. Not out of laziness, but because the world itself had changed its pace. Snow muffled sound. The hammer, the axe, the shouting in the yard, all softened. Everything felt further away. Voices dropped, footsteps quieted. It was not sadness, it was surrender. The earth had spoken, and the villagers listened. Work became different. The outdoor tasks vanished. You could not thresh wheat in snow. You could not cart hay, or tend vines, or walk to the next town without risking your life. But that did not mean idleness. It meant indoor work, quiet work, mending clothes by the fire, sharpening tools, weaving baskets, salting meat, stitching tears in boots that had walked too far through frozen mud. Women spun wool, the spindle humming softly. Men carved handles for tools that would not be used for weeks. Children helped, fingers clumsy with chill, but eager to move, to help, to belong. These moments did not feel like labor. They felt like time folding in on itself, a space between years. In the monasteries, snow changed everything. The monks still rose at matins, still chanted in the dark, but their steps through the cloister were slower. The ink froze in the scriptoriums. The candles dripped more slowly. Even the prayers felt softer, more like breath than voice. The snow covered the graves in the churchyard. The stones lost their names. The trees bent under its weight, patient, bowing to nothing. Even the river stilled beneath its white cover. The world had been hushed. Travelers rarely came. Roads disappeared, landmarks vanished. A path that led safely in summer now turned strangers into shadows. Inns waited with empty benches. Merchants stayed home. Letters stopped arriving. The world shrank to a single village, a single hearth. But within that smallness, something precious stirred. People rested, not lazily, but rightly. They slept longer, told more stories, remembered old songs. The elderly shared memories of winters past. Children listened with wide eyes, their heads against their mother's arms. Life slowed, but it deepened. Time moved like snow, slow, layered, and soft. And there were rituals, too. Waking early to check the woodpile, boiling water before the well froze, knocking the frost from the eaves before it collapsed into the doorway. These tasks became sacred, repeated with care, passed down like psalms. Sometimes the snow made things harder. It brought down roofs, it broke fences, it caved in barns. But no one cursed it. It was just winter, being winter, and they had learned to live beside it, not against it. There were joys, quiet and small. Children dragged each other on sleds made from worn planks. Young men threw snowballs at one another while chopping logs. Girls traced shapes on frosted glass and laughed when the patterns vanished with their breath. Even the animals seemed to feel it. The quiet, the slowness, the sacred pause. Nights were long, but not empty. By candlelight, mothers spun tales of wolves in the woods, of lost princes, of stars that granted wishes if you knew their names. Fathers mended tools and added to the story now and then. Grandmothers sat with hands folded, remembering. The fire cracked, the wind howled, but inside there was only hush. And when morning came, the snow was still there, blanketing everything in its soft decree. Rest, wait, be still. They listened, because they knew the pace would return. The thaw would come. The roads would reappear. The oxen would stir. The markets would buzz once more. But for now, just now, they lived at the rhythm of the snow. And beneath that white silence, seeds slept, dreaming of spring, where the fire held the world together. The cold pushed at the walls each night, creeping in through every seam in the timber, every crack in the stone. Outside, the frost thickened on windows. Wind pressed its hand against the thatch, and the world seemed far too large and far too empty. But inside, in the center of it all, there was the hearth. The hearth was not just where fire lived. It was where everything else circled. It was the heart of the home. And in the deep hush of medieval winter, it beat slowly, steadily, holding the silence back. Its fire was never meant to go out. Each morning, someone would rise early, sometimes in darkness, to stir the ashes and coax life from yesterday's coals. If the fire had died, they would beg a neighbor for a lit bundle of straw, carried like a treasure through the snow. Fire, in those months, was not just warmth, it was survival. Meals began there. A blackened pot swung on a metal hook above the flames. Into it went everything: peas, roots, bits of dried meat, yesterday's crusts. The stew boiled slowly, filling the room with a scent more comforting than rich. There was no need for clocks. People knew time by the bubbling of the pot, by the change in light on the floor, by the crackle of the logs. Children sat close to the fire, sometimes too close. Their cheeks flushed, their hands outstretched, their eyes half closed. It was the warmest spot in a world made of stone and wind. They played there, listened there, dreamed there. Clothes hung on wooden frames near the hearth to dry. Tools leaned against the wall, warming before their morning use. Herbs, tied in bundles above, smoked gently, giving off faint whispers of summer past. And always, above it all, the slow drift of smoke curling toward the hole in the roof, taking yesterday's stories with it. In the evenings, the family drew in tighter. The older ones sat with wool or wood in their laps, fingers busy with mending, carving, knitting. Stories passed back and forth like bread, tales of saints, beasts, lost kings, spirits in the woods. They weren't always told to teach, or even to entertain. They were simply part of the rhythm, spoken softly, shared slowly. The fire lit the faces, and the silence held the rest. Even the animals knew. Cats curled beneath the bench closest to the heat. A dog, if there was one, lay just beside the ashes. In lean years, even the chickens were brought in. The family goat, sometimes a lamb. They were quiet companions. Their presence, another warmth. Births happened here. So did deaths. If a child was born in January, the midwife knelt beside the fire. If a grandmother passed in the night, she was laid near the hearth, wrapped in linen, candles flickering beside her. The fire did not celebrate or mourn. It simply continued. It asked nothing but tending. In its glow, love was whispered, fears confessed, hands held. Songs hummed not for performance, but for remembrance. Even the tired silences that fell between family members were softened here, made gentle by the warmth and the steady sound of burning wood. On feast days, the hearth wore its finest. The stew was richer, a bit of apple added, perhaps a bird caught the week before, maybe even honey, bread baked directly on the stone. Not because there was plenty, but because sharing something warm meant everything. There were no separate rooms, no private spaces, just this one circle. And in winter, it was enough. It had to be. Outside, the world howled. Inside, the fire answered. And when bedtime came, embers were banked carefully, buried under ash, to glow until morning. A last look, a whispered thanks, a soft good night. Because without the fire, there was nothing. No food, no light, no comfort. But with it, even just a flicker, there was life. Tomorrow, the snow would still fall. The wind would still rise. The bread might still be thin. But the hearth would still be there, burning, holding the dark at bay, one small flame at a time. When stories were stronger than the wind, the snow pressed in at the windows, the night stretched longer than memory, and somewhere in the deepest fold of winter, when even the animals slept more and the fire crackled low, the people told stories. It was not just a way to pass the time. It was how they held themselves together. Storytelling was not performance. It was survival of the soul. In villages across medieval Europe, people gathered in the evening, shoulders touching, knees drawn up, eyes wide in the firelight. The air outside was too cold for work, too thick for travel. But inside, there was the voice of a grandmother, or a father, or a neighbor who remembered things no one else did. They spoke of saints who walked across rivers of ice, of wolves that carried children safely through the woods, of spirits who lived in the smoke and only appeared when called by name. These tales weren't written. They lived in breath and silence and shadow. And every house had its own versions. In the northern forests, people feared the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of riders sweeping through the sky on stormy nights, snatching away anyone foolish enough to be outdoors. Children were told to cover mirrors and keep the doors latched tight. In the lowland farms, it was said that elves would sneak in through cracks in the wall, looking for warmth and bread. Leave a crust by the hearth, they said, or mischief would follow. Milk would sour, tools would vanish. A child might fall ill without reason. Superstition lived in every corner. You swept the floor before sunset, never after. You never whistled at night. If the fire popped too loudly, someone far away was speaking your name. If a bird tapped on the window, death might be near. No one questioned these things. They were part of the rhythm, like hunger, like frost, like prayer. But not all stories were fearful. There were tales of lovers reunited by candlelight, of old women who turned out to be fairies, of children who planted seeds in the snow and woke to find flowers blooming from their windowsills. The winters were long, yes, but in the telling, they became magical. Even the church, with all its rules, could not take storytelling away. Priests might warn against pagan tales, but in their own sermons they spoke of miracles, stars that guided kings, voices from the heavens, a God born in a stable in the cold. Stories were everywhere, in parchment, in chant, in echo. Sometimes there were visitors. Traveling minstrels, brave enough to cross snow-laden roads, would stop in a village and trade songs for supper. They brought news, riddles, melodies from places no one had ever seen. Their words curled in the smoke like incense, stirring the imagination. For a night, everyone forgot the weather. The room grew warmer with wonder. But more often, the tales came from within, from memory, from dreams. And children, even the sleepy ones, listened closely. They did not know which parts were real. They didn't need to. They believed. That was enough. In some homes, they told stories in a circle. In others, one voice spoke while the others stitched, or peeled turnips, or stared into the fire. The telling and the doing were never separate. Life was always lived in layers. When the story ended, no one clapped. There was only a breath, a pause. Then someone might ask, "Tell the one about the man who turned into a crow," or "What happened next to the girl with the frostbitten feet?" And so the night continued. The stories filled the cracks that hunger left behind. They softened the edges of grief. They gave children something to dream about, and adults too, though they'd never admit it. Outside, the wind carried its own tale. It moaned against the eaves. It scratched at the shutters. But inside, the words spoken around the fire were stronger. They had weight. They had warmth. And when the embers dimmed, and the room fell into hush, those stories lingered. In the straw, in the blankets, in the breath between sleep and waking. Because in winter, the world narrows, days blur, work slows. But the stories keep going. They move through generations like seeds in snow, waiting, sleeping, ready to bloom when the cold is gone. When the soul turned inward, there were fewer footsteps on the roads, fewer bells ringing from the fields. The hammer fell silent, the market slowed, and so did the heart. For in the depths of winter, when the cold crept into bones and breath, the medieval soul turned inward. Winter was not only a season of hardship, it was a season of spirit. The darkness did not just cover the land, it pulled people into themselves. The long nights became a kind of mirror, and in that reflection, they found not despair, but devotion. There was time now to sit in silence, to pray, not in passing, but fully. Not with hurried hands and half-mumbled words, but with the whole self, the whole breath, the whole longing. In small homes, the family would gather not just for warmth, but for ritual. Grace was said more slowly. Psalms were whispered before sleep. The holy days of Advent and Epiphany offered not distraction, but depth. Each candle lit for Christ carried not just light, but hope. The church, always a fixture of life, became even more central in winter. It was one of the few buildings with true walls, strong stone, heavy doors, and the warm hush of incense. There, beneath the vaulted ceilings, the poor sat beside the wealthy, all wrapped in layers, all wrapped in silence. The flicker of candlelight on stained glass felt like something divine. Mass was more than obligation. It was anchor. The bells calling people to worship sounded clearer against the snow. They echoed farther. The footprints in the white showed who had come. The empty tracks showed who had not. Monasteries were busiest in winter. Monks copied scripture by candlelight, the ink sometimes freezing on their quills. They fasted, they prayed, they walked the stone halls in cold silence, offering their discomfort as a form of devotion. In some orders, not a single word was spoken from sundown to sunrise, just breath and prayer and stillness. Outside, villagers tended shrines buried in snow. They lit votive candles on window ledges, hung herbs beside icons, said rosaries in the pale dawn light. The Virgin Mary was never closer than in winter. She too had known the cold. She too had carried life in darkness. Her image, wrapped in blue and gold, hung in many cottages, watched over cradles, over sick beds, over empty tables. Saints were called upon by name. Saint Blaise for illnesses of the throat, Saint Anthony for lost animals, Saint Bridget to bless the hearth, and always, always prayers to Saint Nicholas, for children, for hunger, for small miracles. But faith was not only in churches or books. It was in the hush of the snowfall, the way it blanketed even the gravestones, the way it forced everyone to pause, to listen. Some called it God's silence. Others just felt it, without words, a presence in the stillness, a whisper behind the wind. Even those who were not devout found themselves more contemplative. When the body cannot move, the mind begins to wander. What have I done this year? What did I lose? What might spring bring, if it comes at all? The questions were never rushed. There was no need. Winter gave them space, and alongside prayer came acts of mercy. It was understood, unspoken, but binding, that winter was when you gave, not out of excess, but out of solidarity. A crust of bread to the widow, a log of wood to the childless couple down the path, a coat passed from one family to another. This charity wasn't separate from faith. It was faith. To tend to another's warmth was to honor the divine. And in this way, the village itself became a kind of church. The fire an altar, the food communion, the silence a hymn. Outside, the frost deepened. Trees stood like sentinels. The rivers wore cloaks of ice, but inside, within soul and shelter, there was something holy taking root. Not loud, not sudden, but real. A quiet kind of grace, the kind that waits with you, breathes with you, and reminds you, gently, always, that light returns. Even now, even here, Bimar, even in this cold. The wisdom in the stillness. When the fields were bare, and the branches bowed low with snow, there was still a kind of language to be heard, if you listened. Nature, in the quiet of medieval winter, was not silent. It was speaking, not in words, but in rhythm, in patience, in example. The people of the Middle Ages did not separate themselves from the land. They lived within it, beneath it, beside it. They watched the sky for omens, read the frost like scripture. They knew the tracks of animals as clearly as they knew each other's names. In winter, when so much fell still, they learned to do the same. The trees, leafless and bare, taught humility. They stood unadorned, no longer feeding the birds or shading the sheep. And yet, they remained upright, rooted, quiet, waiting. People, too, had to wait, through hunger, through cold, through grief that had no name. The tree did not resist its bareness, neither could the soul. Snow blanketed the fields, and nothing grew. But beneath it, the seed slept. This was known, though it could not be seen. The people trusted it, that even in barrenness, there was preparation, that life, when it disappeared, was not gone, only hidden. Nature did not doubt the spring. Neither did the peasant. The birds changed their patterns. Some vanished entirely, flying south. Others stayed, but moved more carefully, darting between hayricks and thatched eaves. Their calls were different, briefer, more precise. The people listened. They, too, had to ration their breath, their effort, their strength. Even the sparrow knew when to speak and when to be still. Ice covered the river. What once flowed now shimmered, unmoving. It was a kind of surrender, and in that there was peace. The world did not have to always move to be alive. There was life in stillness, in reflection. The villagers who once rushed to draw water now walked slower. They dipped carefully. They carried more mindfully. The animals changed too. Cows stood closer together. Their breath rose in clouds. Chickens huddled for warmth. Dogs buried themselves in straw. No one wasted energy. No movement was without purpose. The people watched and learned. It was not laziness, it was wisdom. The world had entered a kind of fasting, a retreat, a collective bowing of the head. Even the moon seemed different in winter. It hung lower, colder, more honest. It lit the snow with a light too clean to be ignored. On cloudless nights, its glow stretched across the fields like a silver prayer. People stood in their doorways and looked up, not to wish, but to understand. The moon had seen many winters. It asked no questions. It simply continued. Sometimes, when the air was still and the sky clear, the frost etched patterns on windows, ferns, feathers, delicate spirals. No one knew how. It was seen as the breath of spirits, or angels, or nature itself leaving marks. A reminder that beauty did not vanish in hardship. It only changed its shape. Children made games of snowflakes, caught them on tongues, tried to find two the same. They never did. That, too, was a lesson. Even in sameness, in endless white, there was infinite difference. Nature taught, always. Taught endurance, when the storm howled. Taught stillness, when the land lay bare. Taught hope, when the first icicle began to drip beneath the sun. Taught humility, when a single snowfall undid a day's work. And the people listened, not with ears, but with the slow agreement of bodies molded by seasons. They didn't resist the cold. They adapted. They didn't demand the harvest. They waited. They didn't scorn the darkness. They lit a candle and kept watch. The church might have given them words for these things: patience, faith, grace. But the land had been saying them long before, in every root, in every gust, in every silence. So when a peasant woke before dawn, saw snow gathered like ash upon the threshold, and heard only the creak of ice beneath the eaves, they did not sigh. They bowed their head. They stepped into the rhythm. Because winter was not a punishment. It was a teacher, and in its hush, the soul remembered how to listen. The empty table and the quiet prayer. By midwinter, the cellars were nearly bare. The last apples had softened. The onions had sprouted small, pale shoots. The bread, if there was any, had gone dry and hard. The salted meat hung in silence, shrinking each day. For the poor, winter was not simply cold, it was hollow. Meals, if they could be called that, were offerings to endurance. Thin pottage made from dried peas, boiled until it lost all shape. Bread cut into thirds and soaked in broth to stretch what was left. A turnip shared between four. Each bite a calculation. Each bowl a quiet miracle. There were no feasts, no seconds, often no words. The hunger was not dramatic. It was slow. It dulled the senses, made limbs heavy, thoughts clouded. The poor did not cry out. They grew still. Their eyes lingered too long on a single crust. Their fingers trembled when scraping the pot clean. And yet, they ate together. Even if there was only one small portion, it was divided. Not because it was fair, but because it was right. The old gave to the young. Mothers went without. Neighbors knocked softly at each other's doors. Not to ask, just to offer. Sometimes they foraged. Even in winter, the land held secrets for those who knew where to look. Nettles growing under rotted logs. Bitter herbs clinging to stone fences. Frozen berries too sour for birds. These were not delicacies. They were lifelines. Gathered with numb hands, boiled with prayer, eaten with thanks. The truly desperate turned to strange things. Bark soaked in water. Leather belts simmered until soft enough to chew. Mice roasted in ashes. There are whispered accounts, rare but real, of families who turned to the unthinkable when famine lingered too long. These stories were not told aloud. They lived only in silence. But hunger also revealed mercy. The monks, though poor themselves, opened their kitchens. They handed out broth, a hunk of bread, a kind word. It was not much, but to the hungry, it was salvation. In some towns, widows with little would still bake flat cakes to share with children. A shepherd would leave half his stew on the step of a grieving neighbor. The fire might have been weak, but it was not gone. Even in hunger, they found meaning. A table, though bare, was still a place to gather. A meal, though meager, was still an act of hope. To eat in silence with others was to say, "We are still here, we are still holding on." And in their hunger, they prayed, not for abundance, but for strength, for tomorrow, for enough. They spoke the names of saints, known to answer the cries of the hungry. Saint Joseph, Saint Isidore, the Virgin herself. And they listened to the wind for any answer it might carry back. Children did not always understand, but they knew when a bowl was too light. They watched their parents' eyes. They heard the stomachs growl in the night. And still, they played in the snow, laughed when the icicles dripped, wondered what the world might taste like in spring. The poor rarely asked why. They had lived too many seasons. They knew that winter came, and winter passed, that hunger arrived, and sometimes so did kindness. They did not curse the land. They did not blame the sky. They folded their hands, tore their bread, and waited, because the hunger would not last forever. And even if the body was weak, the spirit could endure. It had before, it would again. And when the thaw came, when the ground softened and the first green leaf broke the surface, they would gather whatever the earth offered, and they would remember the long hunger, not with bitterness, but with quiet awe, because they had survived it. Together, when the light returned, the change did not come all at once. It began with a sound, soft, uncertain, the quiet drip of melting icicles, the gentle rush of thawed water along the edge of a ditch. It wasn't dramatic. There was no trumpet, no declaration. But to the villagers who had waited, who had endured the long white hush, it was everything. The light was returning. The sun hung a little longer in the sky. Its rays touched the fields with a new angle, a different warmth. The snow receded in patches, revealing dark, damp earth like hidden skin. It smelled of life. It smelled of something waking up. Spring was not here yet, but it was coming, and with it, the people began to rise. The first green shoots pushed their way up beside old fence posts, through cracks in stones, beside the edges of cottage walls. Children were the first to spot them, shouting with wide eyes. A leaf, a sprout, a promise. The adults were slower to hope, but not unmoved. They still remembered the empty bowls, the brittle coughs, the silence of hunger. But they stepped outside, with shoulders straighter, breath deeper. The air no longer bit. It stirred, it whispered. In the fields, the ground was softening. The plow, resting since January, was pulled into use again, not in ceremony this time, but in honest labor. Oxen strained, hands blistered, the soil opened in long, aching lines. But behind each furrow was the beginning of bread, the return of rhythm. Lambs were born in the still cold nights, calves too. Their bleats and cries broke the long quiet. Life was loud again. The barns bustled, the pens filled. People laughed, not in joy, but in relief. They had made it. The fire inside the homes still burned, but it was no longer the only source of warmth. The sun found its way through windows. The shutters were opened. The stale air of winter was pushed out, and with it, a season's worth of sorrow. Spring festivals were simple but sacred. A feast of greens, a song beneath a tree, a maypole raised and ribbons tied by small fingers. There was dancing, not with grandeur, but with tenderness. The steps of people who knew what it meant to be still, and now could move again. And gratitude filled the air like incense. Not the loud kind, not shouted from rooftops. Just a nod, a shared glance, a hand resting on a shoulder. The knowledge that they had endured together and that the worst had passed. The church, too, marked the shift. Lent led to Easter. Ash turned to Alleluia. The resurrection was no longer just a story from Scripture. It was mirrored in the land, in the limbs, in the breath of every sleeping seed now waking. And though grief still lingered, for there were always those who did not survive the winter, the season held them gently. Their names were spoken at the planting of seeds. Their memories folded into every loaf. Loss and life, side by side, as they had always been. The rhythm had returned. The markets reopened. The roads thawed. The bell in the chapel rang again, not for mourning, but for mourning. The children ran farther from home. The elders sat in doorways, faces to the sky. The earth was no longer hard, nor were their hearts, and the spirit, beaten down, but not broken, lifted quietly, not in ecstasy, but in renewal. A soft unfolding, a slow awakening, a moment when all the long nights, the prayers, the empty bowls, the frozen fingers, they all faded into something distant, not forgotten, but forgiven, because spring had come, and with it the proof that darkness always ends. Even after the longest winter, even after the silence, even after everything,